Democracies did not survive because politicians promised that they will. Democracies survive because citizens continue to participate and engage, even when powerful people try to subvert the process. And the danger right now isn't simply misinformation, it's exhaustion. Exhaustion with politics, with selective outrage, exhaustion with conflict, and not knowing what's true anymore. We're connecting those dots in this episode because this was never just about fraud or election security. Check this out.
If you have been paying attention to how this 2026 midterm is building, you might have noticed, I noticed, that Republicans aren't trying to convince voters that their policies are good for the country or that their policies are good for the average person. They are going to try to take the midterm elections. Why aren't you running on achievements and instead focused on messing with how people vote? If their ideas were really popular, you would focus on convincing voters. Vote for us because we brought you $4.58 a gallon in gas, and we brought you the Iran war, and we brought you no new health care plan, even though Trump's been promising it for 11 years. You would say, come out to vote. More people, the better, because we've done such a good job. You would be making your case to the people on the basis of policy instead of obsessing over who gets to vote, which ballots count, how are districts drawn, how can we cast doubt on ballots, how can we deregister people. If you think you're doing a good job, run on that.
Welcome to The Quiet Loud. I'm DeAnthony Collins. If you believe democracy requires participation, accountability, and trust, then you're in the right place. Please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and share. Join our quiet quorum, all right? Let's get into it. For years now, Americans have been told that the greatest threat to our elections was widespread voter fraud. But over and over again, the evidence has never matched that fictional scale of this rhetoric that we hear. And after the 2020 election, Donald Trump and his allies filed dozens of lawsuits challenging election results in multiple states. And according to reporting from multiple legal analyses, 60 some odd plus courts repeatedly rejecting and dismissing the overwhelming majority of those cases for lack of evidence, lack of standing, or just plain old failure to demonstrate outcome-changing fraud. Trump's own Attorney General, Bill Barr, publicly stated in December of 2020 that the Justice Department had not uncovered fraud on the scale capable of changing the election result, meaning they didn't find any for real. But they have to appease Trump by saying on a scale capable of changing the election result. And the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, called the 2020 election the most secure in American history. But even after all those findings, the rhetoric continued to intensify. The conversation shifted from proving widespread fraud to building permanent suspicion around our elections themselves. And that suspicion started attaching itself to everything. Mail-in ballots, which Trump uses, right? Voter rolls, voting machines, ballot drop boxes, you name it, right? Citizenship verification, poll workers, entire cities, entire counties, entire states, right? And now we arrive at proposals like the SAVE Act, which will require documentary proof of citizenship to even register to vote in federal elections, which would be redundant because it's already illegal. You can't be an undocumented immigrant and register to vote. It's already illegal. Okay? But supporters argue that it protects election integrity. But on the other side of that, voting rights groups and legal advocates and elections experts warn that it could create barriers for millions of eligible voters. Now, we've talked about this before, particularly because married women whose current names don't match their birth certificates, meaning if they change their name after getting married, you might have some trouble getting registered to vote. The same could be for elderly Americans or rural Americans, low-income citizens, naturalized people with citizenship, and other people without easy access to that documentation. It may not have or know where to get your birth certificate or your social security or whatever it is that they may be at that time requiring you to have to register to vote. Now, according to studies from the Brennan Center and multiple state-level investigations, documented cases of non-citizen voting remain exceedingly rare. Do you hear what I'm saying? Undocumented immigrants are not voting. They're not voting. The dead are not voting. Okay? Any instances of voter fraud have largely been on the Republican side. All right. Now, that distinction matters because the allegations always collapse, but the restrictions stay. And once that distrust becomes politically useful, the next step isn't proving fraud anymore. It's controlling the rules themselves. And one of the quiet truths about modern American politics is that many of the biggest election fights happen long before anyone casts a vote, long before Election Day, before campaign ads, before debates happen. The battle often begins with the maps. I'm referring to the district maps and who gets to draw them. And in 2025, we heard Donald Trump publicly encourage Texas Republicans and Governor Greg Abbott to ensure that he get more seats in Congress through their gerrymandering efforts, right? Mid-decade redistricting in many states actually is legal, but it is controversial because it allows political parties to redraw power maps outside the normal census cycle. We do this every 10 years because we have a look at how many people are living in these places, how much representation is needed in these places, right? And both parties have engaged in gerrymandering throughout American history, okay? We won't try to play that game, but I'm not equivocating because here's where the modern asymmetry matters. Over the last 15 years or so, conservative legal and political organizations have invested heavily in state-level electoral infrastructure, whereas Dems introduced legislation to end partisan gerrymandering. The Republican red map strategy after the 2010 census aggressively targeted state legislatures, specifically because controlling legislatures often means controlling district lines. So that means they're the ones who control the maps. If you have the state legislature, you're controlling the maps. That means you're controlling who would be the U.S. Congress people for those states as well. All right? So like I said, if you control the map, you often control the conversation before a single vote is even cast. And over the last week, we saw exactly how powerful that strategy still is. In Tennessee, Republicans approved a new congressional map that dismantles the state's only majority black congressional district centered around Memphis. Critics, including civil rights groups and Democratic lawmakers, argued that that move dilutes black voting power. Republicans defended it as lawful partisan redistricting. But either way, the result is the same. Political power shifts through lines drawn on a map. But ironically, when voters in states like California pursued independent redistricting commissions through ballot initiatives and referendums, GOP voices suddenly tried to frame those changes as rigging, right? They went out and took the message to the people, got the people to vote on it, and somehow that's rigging. But when Republican-controlled legislatures redraw maps through legislative power, they frequently describe that as just business as usual. Now, that contradiction matters because the modern Republican Party has increasingly treated structural electoral control as a long-term governing strategy. And we're seeing those battles expand nationwide. In Virginia, debates over district maps, commissions, and judicial intervention from the state Supreme Court continue to undercut democracy and the will of the voter. They've done the same thing, okay? Across the country, courts are becoming central players in election administration, not just referees now, but participants. And eventually, the distrust itself becomes the infrastructure. And once people stop trusting elections, democracy itself becomes permanently unstable. And some of the most powerful people in American politics understand that very well. After the 2020 election, Georgia became ground zero for multiple elections-related controversies. There was the now infamous phone call in which Donald Trump pressured Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find, right? You remember that? Find me the 11,780 votes, which would be enough to overturn the state's certified outcome. All right. There was also fake electors involved in attempts to change the state's certification. And according to reporting and court filings connected to the post-2020 elections investigations, there were also controversies involving efforts to access election systems data. But the broader damage may have been psychological because once, like I keep saying, I'm going to keep saying this because I really want to drill it into you. Once distrust becomes normalized, proof starts mattering less than the representation of this misinformation we keep hearing them spout, that something's wrong with absentee voting, something's wrong with voting machines, something's wrong with voting early. That mistrust spread aggressively online. We saw this. Voting machine companies became targets of widespread conspiracies. Election workers like Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman faced harassment threats even at their homes. Local officials began to resign, public confidence eroded, and social media ecosystems accelerated all of it. Under Elon Musk's ownership, X, which is formerly Twitter, which I still call Twitter if I used it, increasingly became a platform where election fraud narratives and distrust rhetoric spread rapidly among influential accounts. Now, to be clear, none of that proved any elections were stolen. And there is no verified evidence that voting machine manipulation changed the outcome of the 2020 election, but the distinction is absolutely critical. Okay, that distinction is critical, but the amplification itself has consequences. Because if enough Americans, like I said, stop trusting elections, then what? Say it with me now. Our democracy weakens, whether the fraud exists or not. And now we're hearing conversations about federalizing our elections, deploying law enforcement around polling locations, even rhetoric involving ICE cooperation around voter-related data systems. Civil rights groups warn that that kind of language carries historical weight because American history already contains chapters where protecting the vote became a justification for limiting who felt safe exercising it. During Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era, voter intimidation was often wrapped in the language of order and legality and election security. They used poll taxes and literacy tests and selective enforcement, even armed intimidation. You've seen the pictures and videos of people being attacked out in the streets and held up and stopped and dogs and fire hoses, major intimidation. Okay? And no, this is not that same era. Exactly. All right? But history matters precisely when democracies repeat patterns long before they repeat exact circumstances. That's the danger. We see it starting to rhyme. We see it starting to repeat. But to understand how we got here, you have to go back before Donald Trump. You have to go back before 2020, before Stop the Steal, back to a Supreme Court decision in 2013. And that's Shelby County versus Holder. And in that case, the Supreme Court struck down the Voting Rights Act formula that's used to determine which jurisdictions required federal pre-clearance before changing election laws. That pre-clearance system existed because certain states and counties had long histories of racial discrimination in voting. And almost immediately after that ruling, multiple states moved forward with new voter ID laws, polling place changes, registration adjustments, and district restructuring. Civil rights leaders warned that the ruling fundamentally would weaken federal protections. Congressman John Lewis famously said removing those protections was like, quote, throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And what happens afterwards is impossible to ignore. The fight over voting rights didn't disappear. It evolved. Polling place closures disproportionately affected some minority communities. Long lines became common in heavy populated urban areas. Mail voting became politicized and maligned. Election workers became targets, and increasingly, Americans were taught to view the act of voting itself through the lens of suspicion, not participation. And that shift matters because democracy depends on something deeper than laws. It depends on legitimacy, trust, our shared acceptance, and the belief that losing an election is temporary, not existential. Our country doesn't end because a president that we didn't like got elected. We've weathered that. But when presidents start promising that one vote for him means you won't have to vote again, that is a major threat to our democracy. And democracies did not survive because politicians promised that they will. Democracies survive because citizens continue to participate and engage, even when powerful people try to subvert the process. And the danger right now isn't simply misinformation. It's exhaustion. Exhaustion with politics, with selective outrage, exhaustion with conflict, and not knowing what's true anymore. Because once enough people stop trusting elections, democracy itself becomes negotiable. And history shows countries rarely notice a democratic erosion all at once. They notice it afterward. In hindsight, looking back at all the moments where people were told, you're overreacting here, or this is normal, or the system will hold, all right? Maybe the system will hold, but systems only hold when citizens insist that they do, not through violence or cynicism, not through capitulation or surrender, but through participation and vigilance, through refusing to let democracy become something only powerful people get to shape. All right. I'm hopping down off my soapbox, but guys, please take the ball and keep running. Look into these things, and as always, stay grounded, stay informed, and stay loud quietly. It's the Quiet Loud. Y'all take care.